Awesome. Okay, so I'm sure most of you are wondering about what's up with the title for today's sermon. Life is like a video game. That S, you could talk to our summer student Ray Liu about that. Unfortunately, he's not here, so if he's your Facebook friend, you can pester him there. All right, but that was not my doing. It should be life is like a video game. But what do I mean by life is like a video game? I mean, how do video games fit with the Bible, much less 1 Samuel chapter 24 to 26. And some of you may be hoping that some way, somehow, I may be able to justify gaming through today's sermon. Unfortunately, I cannot justify video gaming through today's sermon, and I have nothing against video games, right? But I won't be able to do that. But today, I do hope to use video games as a general illustration as we look at these 3 chapters in 1 Samuel. So what I see about video games is this. From the very beginning, you acquire skills. Doesn't matter which game you're playing, you acquire skills. You've got to learn how to navigate through the game. And with each level, you need to keep using the skills that you learned at the very beginning, but you'll either gain new ones, learn new ones, or you'll find that you'll need to use those same skills in a different way. So, for example, I play Super Mario Brothers. Okay, so everyone's at least seen somebody play Super Mario Brothers before, or you've tried it out yourself, either successfully or perhaps you failed. But everyone's seen it before, right? And one of the first things that you need to do, aside from running, like moving forward and moving backwards, is learning how to jump. And you've got to learn how to jump in different ways. So you need to learn how to jump over gaps, otherwise you fall down the hole and you die. You need to learn how to jump on top of your enemies, otherwise they touch you and you die, right? You need to learn how to jump up onto things. You need to learn how to jump down onto other things. And as each level progresses, you'll find that you need to do something new. Maybe you need to combine your skills. So perhaps you need to jump and shoot out a fireball, right? Maybe you need to do that. Or perhaps you need to run and then learn to jump. And if you don't time your jumps properly, you can die. Right? So you need to be able to hone your skills. You need to be able to hone your skills and practice. And, practice makes perfect, or, the more you experience the game, the better you are at jumping and running or whatever else it might be, right? So I've come to realize that living life is similar. God gives us situations in which we learn something new. We need to learn to be patient. We need to learn to be more kind. We need to learn to exert better self-control. And just as we think that we've got it, another situation comes in which we need to apply what we've learned. The circumstances may be different, and we may fail to recognize what we're supposed to do until afterwards. For example, we may have learned to appreciate our father, but have we learned to appreciate our mother in the same way? We may have learned to extend grace to our friends because we know they're not perfect, but have we extended that same grace to our family members? And perhaps we may have learned not to gossip at work, but perhaps we may share some information about someone at church under the pretense of a prayer item. We need to learn how to discern the difference between those. And we come to learn what to do and what not to do as we encounter new experiences. And this is what David goes through in these 3 chapters of 1 Samuel. So I'd like to look today through chapters 24, 25, and 26. And we're not going to read through the whole thing, and I'm not going to recap all the events because, 2 weeks ago we had Reverend Reg Andrews come and talk about chapter 24, and last week we had Reverend Packlow come and talk about chapter 25. But chapter 26 is actually the bookend to a trilogy of events. So I want to delve a little bit deeper rather than just focusing on what happened, but hopefully you'll be able to follow along. But before we delve into these 3 chapters, I'd like us to pause and reflect about the main person in these stories, David. He was a great man for God, but he wasn't born that way. He's introduced to us as an underdog, a lowly shepherd, and he becomes a great hero who kills a giant in one blow. But he wasn't born that hero. He was shaped during his time shepherding his father's flocks. He spent quiet time with God, and he had to overcome real challenges of fear, patience, and self-control as lions and bears or what have you came to attack his flock. Of course, we don't know directly. We're only inferring. And that's why I'm really excited to look at today's 3 chapters, because this is one opportunity where we get to see the unfolding of how God is shaping David to become the great leader we know him to be. So what lesson did David learn? The original title to today's sermon was Love Your Enemies. But I want us to dig a little deeper than that. Because we've all heard about loving our enemies. Either you've grown up in church or it's, one of those things that Christians do. Right? But what's at the root of loving your enemy? What's the source of it all? Well, to love our enemies and to do other difficult things, which God asks us to do, requires godly character. And we can find those godly character traits in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 to 23. Now, before you start turning to there, unless your Bible's already there, okay, I'd like us to do something a little bit different. Okay, so we just had that Bible passage read out, and for those of us who grew up in church, we should have memorized this to some extent. So what I'd like us to do is that as a congregation, I would like us to recite all 9 aspects of the fruit of the Spirit. So I'll start us off, and I will say the fruit of the Spirit is, and then you will fill in the remaining 9 blanks, okay? The first one is love. That's a freebie. Now you only have 8 to do, okay? But we should be able to do this, all right? So I will mouth them along. If you want to try and read my lips, fine, but I believe we can do this. And I can see people already practicing. That's great. Okay, so the fruit of the Spirit is love. Awesome. Against such there is no law. Everyone, give yourself a pat on the back or applause. Yay. Okay, that's really great. That was more response than I was expecting, so I'm very happy. Yay. So we call them the fruit of the Spirit, but not simply because that's what Paul had written in the book of Galatians, but because we recognize that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, these are beyond our reach. And most often, when we need them the most, we need an extra boost of grace, just to be able to exemplify them in our lives. We need God's Spirit. We need to connect to God in a very intentional way so that this fruit comes out in our lives. And when we spend time with God, being refreshed by his presence, being disciplined by his word, we'll find that love comes more easily to us, joy comes more easily to us, peace comes more easily to us. So which aspect of the fruit of the Spirit did David refine as he learned to love his enemies, Saul and Nabal? And you could easily say all of them, because I'm pretty sure he had to use all of them at one point. But the attitude which spoke loudest to me as I reflected on these chapters is self-control. This is where I'd like us to focus on today. So as you may recall, David's growing popularity with the nation and approval from God didn't sit well with the present king, King Saul. And eventually, King seeks to kill him, despite David marrying into his family and despite David being his son's best friend. In chapter 24, we see that David has been hiding, and Saul finally arrives to the area where David is hiding. But he doesn't realize that he's actually walked right into the cave where David and his men are. David cuts off a portion of Saul's robe instead of killing him right then and there, even though his men urge him to do so, because David acknowledges that Saul is God's anointed king. So what issue did David have with self-control? He didn't kill the guy. Well, let's take a look at verses 4 and 5 in chapters 24. So it says this: The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.' Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe." In the ESV, the English Standard Version, it says, David was struck in the heart, and that's closer to the original Hebrew. In his heart, David knew that he had done something wrong. And most of us would say that he had done really well. He restrained himself from killing his enemy, who was vulnerable right there before him. And I don't know if you remember how vulnerable he was. If you recall, Saul had come into the cave to use that innermost part of the cave as a porta potty. He didn't come in with his swords. He didn't come in with extra men. It was a private moment. And David and his men were right there. He was defenseless. He was quite vulnerable. He wasn't aware of any kind of danger around him. And David easily could have killed him right then and there, but he didn't, not even at the urging of his men. And when we read verse 4, especially, we may think, God has given David this opportunity, so why didn't he strike? Well, what isn't obvious, actually, is that God never spoke of delivering Saul into David's hand. If you recall in chapter 23, David's men had just defended Keilah from the Philistines, and they didn't think they had a chance at winning because the Philistines are strong and their numbers are large. And David just had a rabble of men, people who just come from wherever. But God said, I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. And they won. They won decisively. They defended Keilah decisively. So it's not hard to see now that they're sure of another victory against a more direct enemy of David's, especially given this very prime chance. But if God did say these words, it would have been recorded, just like God's words were recorded regarding Keilah and the Philistines. But it's not there. And David knew God didn't say anything about Saul being delivered into his hands. The only thing that he knew is that he's anointed to be the next king. Now, of course, he can't be king while Saul lives. And so we would just think, you need to get rid of this guy. God's already anointed you. You take your place, because God's already said that you're to be the next king. But David knew that if it's God's choice to anoint, it's also God's choice to raise him as king at the appointed time. It's not supposed to be David's action. It's not supposed to be David's choice. So with him giving up the chance to kill Saul, it's kind of hard for us to begrudge him cutting off this little bit of Saul's robe. But again, David knew that the main action belonged to God, not him, and that his own action of cutting Saul's robe was something he didn't need to do. Sure, it provided great proof when he encountered Saul later on, but his reason for cutting wasn't for proof. But I would say that it was to show who's greater. David let his pride get the better of him, and that's why his conscience was pricked. He knew that if he could show Saul the piece of cloth, it would make this current king feel a little bit smaller, and it would make David feel a little bit bigger. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was also his small act of vengeance. I mean, David, he wouldn't indulge in the satisfaction of killing this man, but he could enjoy slicing off a little bit of his robe. And David recognized these ungodly thoughts in himself. That's why his heart was struck. And through this prick of his conscience, God rebuked David. So moving on to chapter 25, David encounters another man, someone who seems to be just as foolish as Saul. After confronting Saul with what he could have done, David moves on to another area where he comes across the foolish Nabal and the intelligent and beautiful Abigail. Nabal is described as a rich man, almost kingly, and we could say that he represents Saul to some extent in this episode. And what the writer of 1 Samuel wants us as readers to see is that this interaction with Nabal is a reflection of David's interaction with Saul and his hostility. Saul didn't have to chase David. David was to be anointed next, but David had nothing against Saul, and if anything, served Saul really well. And Nabal did not have to insult David. And while the circumstances are different, the attitude in which David needed to have is the same. David had just had a lesson in self-control, learning how to restrain his pride, restrain his desire for vengeance. We see in this event, however, restraint and control doesn't seem to apply. If you recall from last week, David asks for the return of a favor during a season of plenty for Nabal. So there was seemingly no reason for Nabal to reject him. But instead, Nabal rudely replies in verses 10 to 11, if you'd like to follow along. Chapter 25, verses 10 to 11. He says, "Who is this King David?" Who is this David? David's not king yet. "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? Now, I'd be quite offended too if someone was to reply like that to me with such arrogance and with such disdain. But David's first and only reaction to Nabal's base reply is vengeance. He calls his men to strap on their swords, and he straps on his, and he's ready to go. We find out in verse 21 to just eliminate Nabal and all the males in his household. That pretty much wipes out this little clan, this little tribe of his. And it's not until Abigail, the wife of Nabal, rushes to neutralize her foolish husband's comments that David realizes his own foolishness. Didn't he just rebuke his men for desiring to kill Saul? And isn't the matter of the throne, the welfare of the nation of Israel, more important than the return of a favor from a silly, prideful man? And at this point, David realizes that bloodshed is not worth indulging in his desire for vengeance. Every life is precious, and every life is in the hands of God. Saul, the anointed king of Israel, and Nabal's, a foolish rich man. Neither of these lives is for David's taking. He needs to control himself and submit to God's will and timing. So what then about chapter 26? Isn't it just a repeat of what happened in chapter 24? Saul is again told where David is hiding, and he goes to find him. Saul is caught vulnerable yet again, while David has a prime chance to eliminate his enemy. Well, some scholars argue that it's actually the same event, just told slightly differently to show this progression, but I stand with those who see it as a separate event. I'm not going to get into the whys and the hows, but I will note three key differences that I think are also important for us as we're reading it through chapter 26. So for one, the stakes involved in David's opportunity to kill Saul are greater. David is able to sneak into the heart of the army camp, and Saul had 3,000 men with him, but he was able to sneak by all of them, and he kind of did the math, and I think he passes by approximately 100 people, and he wasn't detected at all. So it's not just Saul that is caught vulnerable, but this whole army. The stakes are higher for him to get caught, but this chance, this opportunity is just that much greater. Secondly, this is the first time that we hear of God's action in any of these three episodes. In chapter 24, David does speak of Yahweh sending Abigail to stop him, but the narrator doesn't mention Yahweh as acting as part of the story. It's actually an observation mentioned through David. So in chapter 26, verse 12, we see that God involves himself in this event. He puts Saul and his army, his 3,000 men, into a deep sleep. And this allows David and one of his men to sneak into the camp completely undetected. And thirdly, David stops calling Saul his father. You recall David had married his daughter, Michal, and David was Saul's son-in-law. And so Saul was David's father-in-law. And during their confrontation in chapter 24, David addresses Saul as my father, and Saul addresses David as my son. But if you see the confrontation in chapter 26, David only says, my lord the king, although Saul continues to say, my son. By this time, David has recognized that he is separate from the king of Israel, and he only relies entirely on God. He cannot trust Saul. So this time, David has learned the lesson of self-control. He knows more firmly than ever that all action belongs to God. The temptation in this episode is so much greater, though. He can get right into the camp without anyone noticing him. He can kill Saul and a good portion of his army too, if he really wanted to. Another temptation is that one of David's men offers to kill Saul on his behalf. So David doesn't even have to lift a finger. And this way he can avoid blood guilt directly onto his hands. So if you look in verse 8 of chapter 26, Abishai, the man that, one of his men that comes in with him to the camp, says, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice." Basically what he means by that is that I won't miss. I will only need one hit with my spear, and it'll be done. And that's so much easier than just, cutting off a bit of Saul's robe. You're letting somebody else do all the dirty work. And perhaps some of us would say, yeah, David, why not? You could just say, well, one of my men slipped up and he wanted to do it before I could stop him or whatever. But David knew that if this happened with his awareness, he is approving the action, and people would be linking this action with him, and there would be a stain on his reputation, and there would be blood guilt on his soul. So he tells Abishai to refrain from killing Saul. So instead of instead of doing that, however, he instructs Abishai to take Saul's spear and his water jug. And this time it's for proof, unlike the cutting of the robe, which is more for indulgence. In this third event, David shows that he has learned what to do, which is to wait for God's action and rely on God's faithfulness, and what not to do, which is to take matter into his own hands, no matter how great the justification. He learned from his failure to control his pride and his desire for vengeance when he cut off some of Saul's robe. And he learned from his failure to indulge in his anger and indignation by jumping straight into violent action against Nabal. As I mentioned earlier, David was not born a great person for God. None of us were. As awesome as we may think that we are, we came into the world with a great capacity for sin, and we still have it. God, however, he's been endeavoring to shape us into godly people, if we let him. God never forces us to change. He simply presents opportunities for us to do so. So you turn with me to Malachi chapter 3, verse 3. One of the rare passages that we look into. So Malachi, it's the last book of the Bible. Last book of the Old Testament. Malachi chapter 3, verse 3. And it says there, he will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. So let me just read it one more time. I know some people were still flipping. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. If we submit ourselves to God, he will filter out our impurities, in which I'm sure as we reflect deep down in our hearts, we know that there is quite a bit of. But only when we give ourselves over to God will that happen. God never forces it upon us. But of course, he doesn't leave us without any help. God provides us with vehicles by which he speaks to us, and 3 of these we can see in 1 Samuel chapter 24 to 26. So first off, all of us have a conscience, just like David did. And for those of us who committed to follow after Jesus, our conscience is directed by our desire to be more Christ-like, just as David's was directed to be more like Yahweh. And that's one vehicle, our conscience. Another is through the people around us. David thankfully had Abigail to remind him of how un-Yahweh-like his rush of violence was. So who do you have in your life to keep you accountable for your thoughts and actions? At North Toronto Chinese Baptist Church, we encourage everyone to join a small group, so you have a small community to keep you in check and to be your soundboard for life's events. And we also encourage everyone to participate in larger group activities like next week's church picnic or our weekly Sunday services and our Sunday school classes as well. And it's not just because we have people who really want to play music, or preachers who really like to talk, or teachers who really want to share their knowledge with other people. It's because we all need to have a larger perspective of the body of Christ in action. It's still made up of people, and people aren't perfect. But hopefully we're all striving to be better, striving to have that image of God polished within us, striving to have the fruit of God's Spirit flow from us easily. We'll be there to remind each other of God's desires, to understand each other, to have compassion for one another, to encourage each other to press on, refining that image of God within us. And lastly, from what we can glean from our passage today, God uses situations. So he uses our conscience, he uses the people around us, and he uses situations. He refines us in that fire of what may seem to be an unnecessary problem to cement within us the fruit of his Spirit. David learned about self-control in chapter 24, but how much quicker did he learn about it when he came across Nabal? We need to be aware of what God may be teaching us and what he may be using to purify the good work that he's already begun within us. We need to be aware of how we failed so we can learn from our mistakes and learn how to live a godly life. So to do so, we need to give up ourselves and we need to connect with God. One lesson I've been giving the last month during the children's worship time is actually about giving our control up to God. And it involved remote controls, and I don't have those visuals here, but I'm sure you can imagine a Wiimote or TV remote or your PS3 remote, whatever it might be. And what it was talking about is that in some ways, we are like remote controls. We're better when we're in someone's hands, and for us humans, we're better when we're in God's hands. Now, of course, there is a fundamental difference. Remote controls cannot choose, and they don't have consciousness, and they can't move. They can't do anything unless they're in someone else's hands. Now, for us, as people, we can. We have the choice. God has given us choice. And we can choose to be controlled by money, by friends, by family, by our hobbies, by whatever it is in life that God has given us. Or we can choose to be controlled by God. We have the choice to be controlled by all of these things. But it's only when we put ourselves in the expert's hands that the best of ourselves would be able to come out. And as Christians, we want the best of God to come out in us. And so we need to actually give up our control to God. Let him take control of us so that we could exemplify him best in our lives. So ironically, yes, to be better self-controlled, David needed to give up his own desire for control, his own desire for vengeance, and he had to give that into God's hands and timing. But when he did, it wasn't difficult for him to know what to do by the time he got to chapter 26. He didn't pause when he was towering over the sleeping Saul, but responded with confidence to preserve Saul. And when we do give ourselves up and submit to God's will, we'll be amazed at how easily God's fruit flows out from us. And it'll be awesome because not only will it get easier for us over time, but we'll be able to be that encouragement to someone else who's struggling perhaps with the same thing or something a little bit different. We'll be able to be Abigail to a fellow brother or sister in Christ and support them and help them refine the image of God in their lives. So life is like a video game. Each chapter of our lives, we go through an experience which gives us a new skill or refines one which we've already acquired. In 1 Samuel chapters 24 to 26, David learned how to have self-control. So what is it that God may be shaping in you at this point in your life? As summer 2010 wraps up, most of us are moving into a new chapter or perhaps a sub-chapter in our lives. Maybe it's going to a new school or just the fact that we're going back to school. And for some people, it's a new job. Perhaps it's a promotion. And we've had a number of weddings in our church, so perhaps it's starting a new family, or it's expanding your family. What skills do we need to bring with us? What new skills do we need to obtain? What aspect, which part of the fruit of the Spirit do we need more grace for, so it will be exemplified in our lives? And these aren't just for major changes, but for everyday events as well. And for those of us who have children, we need patience every day. And I'm sure a lot of you would argue that you need patience every hour or every 15 minutes or every minute. And for those of us who are in the workforce, maybe we need joy every day. For those of us who are dealing with financial issues or a difficult family situation, maybe we need peace beyond understanding every day. There's something that we all need to work on. There's always something that we need. There's always sin crouching right at our door, but there's always God right there ready to help us. No matter what it is, how big or how small, remember to surrender yourself into God's control rather than your own. 2 Timothy chapter 4 says to be prepared in season and out of season. Allow Jesus to refine you in his fire, as Malachi depicts in chapter 3, verse 3. Then we'll see God's promises and blessings unfold in our lives. And then we can be great men and women for God. Let's bow down for a word of prayer.